Hi everyone, my name is Vidyaraman and I'm joined by my co-author Divya. We are going to be talking about compliance map connecting regulations to frameworks for smart audits. Next slide. We are from Deep Dive Labs. We are a Singapore-based startup. We are providing data and AI services. Our services, we have three key areas. We do training, solutioning, and consulting. And we are currently working on two parallel streams. One is we have introduced a Trailblazer bootcamp called GenAI Essentials for Educators. So if you know of any educators, do please refer them. But more to the point, for this particular presentation, we are working on developing a microSaaS tool called Reg Experience, for which we are developing the core technology, and this is part of that particular track, so to speak. Next slide. So we will be talking about a few areas today. I will be walking through a compliance system overview and talking about the notion of document mapping and key challenges and the motivation for that. Divya will then be taking over and be talking through the core technical specifics of compliance map key findings, and then we will go through some Q&A. Next slide, please. So from a compliance system overview standpoint, there are three major players. The first is on the left, regulators. The second is on the right, non-regulatory agencies like NIST. These are the standards authority. And at the bottom are the enterprises that are actually developing products and services. So the regulators, which is the Monetary Authority of Singapore or the Infocom Media Development Authority, they publish regulations. Um, on the right, the non-regulatory agencies, they publish what is called as a control framework, like the NIST privacy framework or the 853. On the bottom, the enterprises on their side, they have a bunch of processes, systems, products, and services, each of which have a number of internal agencies that are meant for regulating all of these systems. Now, the regulation in enterprise is supposed to be complying with the regulation, and as a consequence of that, they produce what is called evidence documents in order to validate or prove that they comply with the regulation that the regulator has published. On the right side, we have frameworks which can be useful to certify if a regulation, if an enterprise is adhering to certain standards or certain requirements set forth in the frameworks. Now, what we are doing in this particular work is we are trying to take the regulation and we are going to try and map it to the frameworks on the right hand side so that these kind of audits can be made much more simpler. So keep this picture in mind, specifically the enterprise compliance regulation is number one, and I will come to it a bit later to set context. Next slide, please. So in order to do this particular mapping, we need to do a document mapping process, which is effectively taking the structured information in different parts of a text and mapping those similar text into different document sets. Now, as you can imagine, there are a number of challenges here. And one of the major challenge is that the documents have varied formats. Some of them are PDF, some of them are Excel. And we have diverse information hierarchy, which means that the information hierarchy for each one of them might be completely different. Last but not the least, each of these requirements might apply to different multiple stakeholders. So we need to be mapping the correct kind of requirement based on the right kind of stakeholder as well. Next slide, please. So if you recall our earlier slide in the compliance ecosystem, we had step number one, and as a motivation, we had previously worked on doing step number one as a regulatory framework called TRACE. And this work was presented at the Computational Legal Studies Conference in Singapore Management University. As a continuation of that work, we are now going to be doing regulation to framework mapping. Next slide, please. So to give a quick understanding of what these regulations look like, this is the DPTM certification checklist, which is published by the IMDA in Singapore. Next slide, please. This is the checklist structure of the earlier PDF. So you can see that it has a set of principles, 4 principles, and then there are a number of sub-requirements which each talk about different stakeholders and different specific requirements around privacy. Next slide, please. On a similar note, we have the NIST privacy framework, which is again a tool for improving privacy. And you can see here is a screenshot of the NIST privacy framework, the Excel sheet, which is published directly on their website. Now, if we go to the next slide, we will be able to see the information hierarchy for the NIST privacy framework. The NIST privacy framework, unlike the DPTM, has function and then a category and then a subcategory or a framework requirement. And as an example, there are 5 types of functions which you can see on the right. So this sets a context between what the regulation looks like and then what the privacy framework looks like, purely from a structural standpoint. Next slide. So now in this particular work, what we are doing is we are taking the regulation and mapping it to the framework. There are a number of good reasons why we need to do this from a compliance standpoint. But one of the major takeaways from this slide is the third point, which is the enhanced understanding. Because of doing this particular regulation to framework mapping, we have a visual mapping that clarifies departmental roles within the compliance teams and also an understanding of which particular requirement maps to which particular regulatory requirement there. We are talking about framework requirements and regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. So finally, to illustrate the compliance mapping, on the left-hand side, you have the DPTM checklist, and on the right-hand side, you have the NIST framework. We have taken the exact PDFs that you have seen earlier, but we have just broken it down to indicate the information hierarchy there. So on the left-hand side, you have principles, sub-requirements, and then split by stakeholders. On the right-hand side, you have the NIST framework, which is function, category, subcategory, and then finally the actual requirement itself. Now, the purpose of this particular work is to map these leaf nodes, so to speak, but while maintaining the entire relationship so that the map of a compliance from a regulation to a framework is very clearly articulated. Next slide, please. I will now hand over to Divya, who will walk you through the actual compliance map process and some of the nitty-gritties from a code standpoint as well. Over to you, Divya.
Thanks, Vidyaraman. So now since the context is set really well, so let's go into the functioning of how do we create this map. So as you can see here, it's sort of a 4-step process. So first we need to process the DPTM checklist because it's in a PDF format. We want to create an information hierarchy so that we can understand the different regulatory requirements. And then we process the NIST privacy framework so that we can get the framework requirements itself. Then, of course, we need to look at similarity between both of them, right? So that is where there is a core component of the large language models coming into play so that we can see similarity. And then I will talk about how do we create the compliance map itself on Neo4j. That's what you're all here for. So I'm going to show some of these components on the code level and some of them on the Neo4j database itself. So let me switch to talking about the DPTM checklist and the NIST privacy framework at the code level. So you can get access to this on our GitHub as well. So as we have seen earlier, the DPTM checklist itself is a PDF format. So we have taken one of the initial steps of our earlier work where we mapped regulatory requirements to evidences or internal policy to make this thing, whether the policy adheres to a regulation. So we've sort of taken the first step of this regulatory requirement extraction, which is essentially a chain of thought prompting to convert this PDF into a structured format. So if you look here, we've sort of extracted the category, the title, and the description. So this is what the DPTM checklist, or the data protection trust mark, that's what DPTM stands for. So these are the descriptions itself that we have extracted. And in order to sort of later map into the framework, we have also created the embeddings for them. So this for this, we have used the GPT-4 turbo model, and for creating the embeddings, we have used the GPT-4 small text embedding 3 small. So that's the embedding using which we have created the description embedding. So next, let's move on to looking at the NIST framework. So the NIST framework is an Excel sheet, but it does require a lot of data cleaning. So one of the key problems with the NIST framework is, unlike the regulatory requirement, the regulatory requirement descriptions in and of itself stand by itself. Whereas the NIST framework actually, if you look at it, so it has a function and a category and subcategory. The subcategory is what we are calling the framework requirement itself. So let me switch over to the presentation so that I can make so what we have done is the subcategory, which we are terming here as the framework requirement, in and of itself do not stand. So there's a lot of contextual information which gets hidden in the function and the category level of the document. So we've sort of borrowed or got motivated by one of the recent work from Anthropic in order to generate a better context-aware retrieval augmented generation. So what we have done is we have created a prompt wherein we give the framework requirement along with a functional objective and category to get a more contextualized requirement. This particular process, we found it helps a lot in the NIST framework, because that helps you to find the contextualized requirement, whereas in the regulatory context, the DPTM checklist, it wasn't required because the regulatory descriptions were self-explanatory. So this contextualized framework requirement, as we call it, as you can see, this just talks at a very high level: system, product, services that process data are inventoried, right? Whereas here it talks with the objective of organizational understanding and management of privacy risk associated with the data processing, which is the category under which it is. So switching to the code, sorry about the constant switch, but hopefully you are able to map together. So what we have done is we've gotten the contextualized framework description and the corresponding embeddings as well. Right, so that sort of gives us the step 1 and step 2, which we have processed. So moving on, let's move on to step 3 and step 4. So step 4 is where we are going to put it into the database. But before that, it's important to understand how do we find similarity, right? So we have taken a very simple cosine similarity, and we have looked at the top 5. So we are sort of mapping here the DPTM regulatory requirements to the framework. So since we are starting with the DPTM requirements, for each of the DPTM requirements, we are going to map the corresponding 5 closest NIST framework requirement, rather from the contextualized NIST framework requirement we have created, to just set sort of get a sense of the dimensions of all of these. The DPTM requirement has 50 regulations itself, and the NIST framework actually has 100 frameworks. So we are sort of mapping this, each of these 50 needs to be mapped to one or many of these 100. Here we have taken the approach of looking at the top 5. So this So you can look at all of these information on our GitHub. We have also loaded all of our CSV so that you can take a deeper look at it. So basically, you can see here for each of the regulatory requirement, we have gone ahead and created the similarity score and the corresponding framework description, right? So these are the steps that's sort of required in order to now we are ready to sort of go into the next step, which is creating the graph database itself. So the graph database, again, you can, I currently used my local database so that I can load as much of data as I want, but you can use the Neo4j sandbox as well. So this is fairly simple. So we start loading the data, right, in this in each of the information hierarchy that was talked about. So let me quickly go on to talk a little bit about the graph model before I can showcase the graph itself on Neo4j. So each of these on either ends are the document. One is the DPTM document, the other is the NIST document. The principles and functions, we have sort of categorized it as the same node category as functions, right? So DPTM has 4 different functions, whereas NIST has 5. And then there were categories under them, and then the requirements, right? So what we have done in the mapping code is essentially to map each of these DPTM requirements to 5 of these framework requirements, so that so as you can see, most times in organizations there's a lot of redundant work happening because they already have a certification of this thing, so they've already so this helps in sort of reducing or doing a better compliance management system itself. So let me now just stop sharing so that I can go on to show you. Okay, I'm going to share my entire screen. Hopefully you all can see. I'll wait for it to come in. Okay, so this is the compliance map that we have created. So let me start off by showing you the 2 documents, right? So the 2 documents, DPTM on one end and NIST privacy framework on the other side. So here, if I look at it, so there are 4 functions of the DPTM checklist. So I'll just expand it a little bit so that whereas there are 5 functions of the NIST framework. So each of these functions, again, sort of go into multiple subcategory, right? So we say DPTM contains these functions, and these are defined by these categories, and the requirements itself comes here. So each of these category requires each of these to be checked, right? So that's the flow on. Probably I'll just make it a little bigger so that you can see it more clearly. Right, so that's and then on the NIST side, you have the same functions going on to the different category, and then here we have these different requirements. To just quickly show you, this is what we also load the not only the code but the description and the contextual description as property of the node itself. And where does the mapping happen? So once we did the mapping, this is where the mapping happens. The each of these rows or pink color nodes, which are the DPTM regulatory requirements, get mapped to multiple of these framework requirements. So now let's quickly look at the first question is always like, what are the top common requirements, right? Which are the more popular ones. So as I said, to just quickly get back, so there are 50 of these nodes, the pink color nodes, and there are hundreds of these cream color nodes, which are the framework requirement. So I'm going to go ahead and show you. So these are the top. So the first thing is not all the framework requirements were mapped. So if you actually run through the list, there are 49 of it. So of the 100 requirements, only 49 of the requirements were mapped. And these are the top three, right? So you have the legal, regulatory, and contractual requirements, which have as many as 25 nodes coming in, right? So there are multiple of these regulatory requirement, which is mapping to this particular framework requirement itself. And then, of course, policy, processes, procedures for enabling data processing preferences, because that's a very important part of your privacy data processing side. And then we also have the mechanisms for data processing purposes. So the key thing that I wanted to sort of highlight here is, so you can see that all different functions of these frameworks have been mapped, right? So you have the governance, and then you have CT stands for control, communication. So you can start seeing that what are some of the common regulatory requirements, so that you can put more resource allocation in creating evidence on those categories, right? So that's the key idea here, to ensure that your compliance process gets done better. So let me then go on to, let's look at what are the requirements which have not gotten mapped. So of the 100, only 49 of them of the framework requirements got mapped from the regulatory. So these are the other 51 which have not gotten mapped. So if we actually take a slightly deeper look, you will see that so these are like mechanisms that are implemented to achieve a resilience requirement in normal and adverse situation. So these are, if you look at the DPTM checklist, these aren't talked about in the current DPTM checklist. So that's something that that's why they haven't necessarily gotten mapped. The same with regard to system products that support organizational priorities are identified and key requirements communicated, right? So all of those have not been mapped to the DPTM requirements. So let me go on to, so this is the map that you saw on this thing. So we took a closer look at the top framework requirements that got mapped, and then we also took a look at what are not mapped. Finally, we have a very interesting comparison. So we looked at, in order to understand if this mapping is actually doing a good job or not, to understand relevancy, what we did was we took a look at two of the close NIST framework requirements. So just to let you know, so these are the two which are under the control category. CT stands for control function. So one of the requirements says data elements can be accessed for alteration, whereas the other one says data elements can be accessed for deletion. So why don't I just go into the map so that I can show you what's the difference between that, right? So this is for alteration. So if you look at it, so and then I can go and look at, so this sort of, there are three of the regulatory requirements which are mapping to this particular framework requirement, right? Whereas the deletion one, there are four of them, and then we'll do a quick comparison between both, right? So of which there are four of them. So once you sort of start reading up all of these, I'll probably go back to my this thing. So you see that one of the top heavy or where the score was very high was where it talks about access control, which is relevant for both altering data records or for deletion. Right, and also to provide information on mechanism to access records, right, because only when you access you can also request deletion. Whereas in the alteration framework, you can see the regulatory requirement that has gotten mapped is the organization shall provide information on the mechanism for correction request and keep records of such requests. Whereas on the deletion, it's sort of mapped very correctly to ensuring measures to ensure outsourcing of disposal, destruction, or anonymizing of personal data. Of course, at two different levels, one that are held by organization and third parties, and also in accordance with the data protection obligation. So you can see that all of these mapping actually makes a lot of relevance. So to sort of summarize, some of the key learnings that we have gotten from this work is we mapped the DPTM requirement to the NIST privacy framework. While mapping, we realized that we can sort of have a common information hierarchy for both documents. Also, they come with their own structure, function, under function category, and then the requirement, either regulatory requirement or the framework requirement. So building these contextual framework requirements, especially in the era of LLMs, have been very good in order to do the mapping. Of course, we do want to try a few other embedding as well, but we already see in our analysis that these mappings are relevant. And these contextual framework requirement, because earlier in at least like a year or two back, we used to concatenate the function and the category along with the subcategory to sort of get all the keywords in order to do the encoding itself, whereas now we can do more contextualized requirements. So what do we are looking at future, right? So this work has also taught us how the regulations most times are not as structured as the DPTM as we've seen here, right? So they are typically a little bit more unstructured, like the Monetary Authority of Singapore's TRM guideline, which stands for Technical Risk Management. So we are currently working to map the MAS TRM with the NIST 853. So we are using this hierarchy of extracting the functions and under that the different categories and the requirement in order to parse the regulation in order to be able to map it. Further, of course, in this case, we have only on the regulatory side, we were able to break down the requirements into multiple stakeholders, like the internal stakeholders, because some of the regulations are aimed at internal stakeholders, some are aimed at external stakeholders, like the third-party vendors or job seekers, right? So whereas in the framework also that happens, we haven't broken down. So that will, if we put the stakeholder information, that will give us one more level of information on which we can filter or make better decisions. All right, so with that, I will end my presentation. Do follow us on LinkedIn for any or for all regular updates from our team. And yeah, if this is a quick call out, in case compliance is the area that you're working on, we would love to have you as beta testers for our upcoming product, Reg Experience, that Vidyaraman mentioned earlier. So please do write to us, connect to us, so that we would love to hear your feedback. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions if there is any time left.